It's the week ending Friday the 28th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Ukraine and the United States agreeing a deal in principle over Ukrainian minerals, Sir Keir Starmer cutting the aid budget to boost defence spending, and the death of Hollywood legend Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Irenie Forshaw. We welcome back journalist and campaigner Elizabeth Carr-Ellis and the deputy editor of Money Saving Expert Gary Caffell. Hello all.
Hello.
Hello.
It is Oscars weekend. Are any of you going to be staying up to watch?
I'll wait until the morning and then attack the dresses.
Interesting. So you record it, do you, at 1 a.m, and then you wait till the following morning, because the problem is you get spoilers on social media, don't you, if you don't watch it immediately when you wake up?
No, I'll be straight on the Daily Mail site to find out they're best dressed and worst dressed.
Gary, are you interested in any of that? Have you watched any of the big movies?
No, I mean, with young children, I've long realised that staying up late does not work, because that does not mean that they stay in late. So, I can't say a late night and early morning. It just doesn't work for me, I'm afraid.
There are some great kids' movies nominated, though. You could stay up all night with your Wallace and Gromit flags. Irenie, I notice your silence. Are you too highbrow for award ceremonies?
I'm just not going to be. I can't be staying up that late. I'll just be, reading the news in the morning.
I'll tell you what, I'll do a comedy monologue for you at the end of the show, and then you don't need to watch the Oscars. Okay, Elizabeth, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week we need to extinguish the use of PFAS in our fire stations.
The main concern with PFAS is its use during the manufacturing phase.
You have severely contaminated watersheds, groundwater, things people are drinking, they're cooking with, they're eating, and as a result, high incidences of cancers and other sicknesses in those areas. It's very much a human issue.
The path to removing PFAS, a video posted by clothing brand Patagonia last week. Elizabeth, what's the story this week, and what is a PFAS? I don't know what that is.
PFAS is deep breath, perfluoroalkyls and polyfluoroalkyls.
I'm simply not in a position to correct you.
I have been practicing that all morning, trust me. And these are man-made chemicals that have been around for about the last 100 years that resist heat, water and oil. It's easier to call them PFAS or forever chemicals because they last forever. They do not break down easily. And they're in the news this week because, first of all, I think I'm going to claim the prize for the most under-the-radar story ever on the podcast.
Wow.
Because I had never heard about these until I was chatting to members of the Fire Brigades Union at the weekend, and they were explaining the dangers of PFAS to me. The trouble with PFAS is not only does it last forever, so it's really bad for the environment, it has been linked to a number of health problems, including a risk of cancer. Cancer is the biggest occupational health risk that firefighters have. It's been found that they are 1.6 times more likely to get cancer than the rest of the population. Some forms of cancer, for example, prostate cancer, and fire brigades are predominantly men. I think it's something like 92% men. Prostate cancer, they are 3.8 times more likely to get prostate cancer than the rest of the general public.
Okay, but don't firefighters in that very important but very dangerous job get exposed to carcinogens anyway? Burning plastic, asbestos. How do we know that it's anything to do with the clothing they're wearing?
It's not just the clothing that is the problem. PFAS is in everything. So when they are fighting fires, PFAS is in the smoke that they're inhaling. It is in the sites that they are going to fight fires. It is also in their fire stations. It is in and on their PPE, and it's in the foam that they're using. So there is a fourfold increase in the amount of PFAS that they are being exposed to just in their general job. And what shocked me most of all was that some fire stations have no means for them to decontaminate themselves at the end of a shift. The FBU advises them to basically decontaminate after every fire. Some fire stations don't have showers. Some of those that have showers, they don't have any sort of detergents or soaps. And the firefighters I was talking to, and I'll say hello to them because they were very cute, as you would want firefighters to be.
Can't believe you're perving on public service workers.
I am
of my podcast.
I am embracing the sexism is my new phrase. I'm doing it here because they were just really good guys and very interesting. And they told me that there had been one of these, these UV light tests that can trace chemicals on your body. They did that on a firefighter at the end of his shift. And by the time he got home and got changed, the toxins from his body and his clothing had transferred to his child's hands. So they're getting passed around the population.
Yes. So for people listening thinking, well, this, sort of as I indicated earlier, this is obviously a difficult scenario for firefighters, but on the other hand, they know they take a risk when they sign up for the job, Irene. These chemicals can come into contact with civilians who aren't firefighters as well.
Yeah, and it's kind of scary when you start to think about everywhere that these forever chemicals are. So, we come into contact with them through things like non-stick frying pans, through our dental floss, our cosmetics, our food packaging, but they're also in our water, soil, air. So it's kind of unavoidable. We kind of can't really get away from them. And they even go straight into our landfill waste, and then they're spread through our air and water from there. And I saw a study that came out quite recently about looking into different food and drink in Britain, and it was a shockingly high amount of these products were found to have these harmful toxins in them. So more of half the food and drink that they tested had these forever chemicals in them, and something like 95% of strawberries have these forever chemicals in them. Yeah. So, and I wouldn't have even thought to, when you get some strawberries for a picnic, sometimes I wouldn't even rinse them, but now it's kind of, it makes you think, actually, God, these are in everything. So even if you tried your hardest to avoid them, it's impossible.
That's pretty alarming stuff, isn't it? I mean, when you mentioned the floss as well, the dental floss, I mean, that's something that is pushed on me by my dentist every time I go. They give me free samples like drug dealers. They want you to take the floss. I've never heard anyone say, oh, and by the way, it's got a chemical all over it that's toxic.
That's the thing, because with things like a non-stick frying pan, I know a few people that wouldn't use a non-stick frying pan. I wouldn't really use a non-stick frying pan, but I think when it comes to just things like cosmetics, you're not thinking about that at all. But yeah, they're everywhere.
Gary, from a consumer standpoint, what could be done about this then? Because I suppose awareness is the issue, isn't it? If there was a big fluorescent sign on the packaging of these items, then the public would be more aware, but there isn't.
No, you're right. I think these stories this week have started to generate a little bit more interest in this, so we are seeing possibly a little bit more awareness now. In the UK at the moment, there are no measures on PFAS currently under review, and actually, according to Breast Cancer UK, since Brexit, the actual UK regulations on chemicals have fallen behind those in the EU. So obviously they're clearly really concerned about this because they can see the medical issues. They say no harmful chemicals have been regulated in the UK since 2020, and only 2 are currently under consideration. It says the EU, in contrast, has actually restricted 8 chemicals and has 16 more being evaluated. Now, Breast Cancer UK is actually calling on the government for a UK chemicals strategy. It says this has been promised by the government since 2019, and we're still waiting. That being a clear timetable in which these chemicals, forever chemicals, would be phased out. But in the meantime, they're calling on at least make sure UK regulations follow those on the EU, which are a little bit more stricter than we've got over here.
But then I guess, as Irene was indicating, if people know, then they choose. She chooses not to use a non-stick frying pan. Is phasing them out the right answer? There is risk inherent in all sorts of things. Maybe it's just easier to tell people. Yeah,
is there an awareness campaign behind this? Do you want to make people make their own choices? You're right. I think there's been a ban in France at the moment, and it's got general support, but it's not widespread support. People in France are saying actually, the Parliament's approved the ban. It's still got to be signed into law by President Macron, but it's pretty much that's going to come in now. What the opposition to that are saying, actually, it will just make people buy stuff from China, India, made with even more harmful substances. So you're almost trying to solve one problem but causing another.
The firefighters you met, Elizabeth, once you'd finished objectifying them, what did they say they wanted to happen?
They are after less use in PFAS in the equipment that they have.
So it is about the clothes they're wearing?
Not just the clothes, but also the firefighting foam. And there is moves to, I think from July, one form of PFAS extinguishers is going to be completely banned in the UK. So there are good moves happening. They are more after trying to get decontamination into their stations more than anything else, because they acknowledge that in some cases these things are good. You know, this is the trouble with trying to find alternatives. There are trade-offs. Some things are not as good as the PFAS for
putting out fires.
Exactly. Or, you know, Patagonia, the clip we listened to at the beginning, it took them 15 years to find a suitable alternative for their waterproof clothing. So that's going to be expensive. It's not going to be as easy to get as most textiles are doing. So there are alternatives coming through, and as I said, the firefighters really, they want to be decontaminated. They have a campaign which is called Decon that I would encourage everybody to go and have a look, and to have a write to their MP and ask them to support the firefighters, and let's at least get them showers with soap and detergents into their stations.
And Elizabeth, something else has been happening around this week in the United States as well, I saw.
It has, yes. In South Dakota, the senators have unanimously backed a bill requiring fire departments to label their protective gear with its PFAS content. So at least then the firefighters can know what they're up against, which is a great move, and I'd like to see more of that.
Gary?
Yeah, I mean, I would be interested to know what that actually means in reality. You know, do you have an option? Is there other uniform that you can wear? You know, it's all well and good being labelled, but if there is no other option to hand, you're kind of a little bit stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Irene?
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about like the companies that are kind of doing their best, that are actually manufacturing these chemicals, but they're doing their best not to make this public knowledge. It's in their interest to hide it. And I was really interested to see this article last month about these residents in Jersey, and because there's the manufacture of this firefighting foam there by this company 3M, that's got into their water drinking supplies, and they had no idea. This has been happening over decades and decades, and a lot of them are getting cancer, they're having all sorts of problems, and now it's got to a point where things are so bad that they're being recommended bloodletting to kind of, that's the only thing left to try and refresh their blood, because the chemical levels have got to have, they just build up and build up and build up, and now they're at such dangerous levels. So I think it's also, if you're not given the knowledge in the first place, and it's in something like your drinking water, you know, you're not choosing to, you're just having a drink, you're not choosing to buy anything, and that seems really unfair for those residents.
And I suppose, meanwhile, the companies, as we were saying earlier, that are investing in developing alternatives to these, they're not going to necessarily see the rewards of that, because people are price sensitive, aren't they? They're going to go for the thing that does the job, repels the water, keeps their frying pan non-stick, that's cheaper, and that will be the one with the PFAS on it.
Exactly. And it's also horrible using a non-stick pan as well. So, you know, it's annoying.
I mean, I've just bought a non-stick pan and I love it, but you've soured my evening entertainment as I fry an egg.
You can get ceramic, or you can get silicone.
Sorry, I meant it's horrible using a non-stick pan. It's so hard. It's
Okay.
so like, it's like I'm suffering every time I use the non-stick pan.
There you are. Now you're talking my language. Right, up next, the only way is up, baby, for energy bills. So is it time to drill, baby, drill? That's after this, baby. Okay, Gary, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The rocketing utility bills we just have to fix.
There's a lot of people here in the winter, and it's obviously, a time where it's a difficult time for everyone with the energy crisis.
The bills go up, the utilities go up, but we all struggle, and they struggle even more.
I come so that I can get a good meal for £3. I can sit in a warm place and a pleasant place.
People do come as a source of escaping increasing energy demands and bills being, increasing in that way.
People at the West London Community Kitchen Nourish Hub talking to Sky News on Tuesday about energy prices, Gary. They're going up again. So I'm guessing it was a busy week for you at Money Saving Expert.
Yeah, another busy week. You know, this is the third consecutive rise we've had in energy bills under the price cap. So yeah, another busy ride. You know, people there were talking about how they're going to struggle with bills at the moment, or currently struggling with bills, and obviously it's going to get even worse in April. Now, it has been a hot topic this week. You know, reason is energy regulator Ofgem announced a further hike from April. It covered the April to June price cap level, and that's going to go up 6.4% on average, and essentially this is affecting everybody in the country who's on one of their suppliers' standard variable tariffs. So essentially, if you're not on a fixed deal, not on a special time of use tariff, you are going to be having energy bills 6.4% on average higher from the 1st of April. Now, obviously that has hit the headline, but there is plenty going on under the radar in the energy world, and I think plenty to unpick about energy system, which is why I did actually select this as my story of the week. That, and actually I want to help you all and the listeners save a couple of £100 on your bills.
Right, OK, well, let's unpick that in order then. What is going on underneath this headline story? Because there feels like there's almost an inevitability to the rise in energy prices now, because they've got this cap and it goes up and there's a discussion and there's a sort of tease, isn't there? Everyone's anticipating it before it happens. It's almost not news because you're anticipating it. But what's the thing we're missing? What don't we know?
Well, I think one reason is why are these going up, and I think it's really important to understand quite how our energy system works and why we are having to pay these high prices. Essentially, the reason this price cap is going up is because there's been a huge uptick in global wholesale price of gas. Geopolitical concerns, supply and demand pressures, and that causes 78% of this increase, according to Ofgem, on the price cap is to do with this spike in wholesale prices. We are so reliant at the moment on what's going on in the global market. We don't have enough renewables to power the system completely over here, so we're reliant on that. And until we sort of address that, we're going to see these prices go up and up, unfortunately.
OK, so Irene, what does it look like in the rest of the world? How do our energy prices compare to elsewhere?
So our electricity in the UK is incredibly expensive. When you compare it with countries in the European Union, our domestic electricity ranked the 4th highest in the first half of 2024. Those are the most recent figures from the government. And we were only beaten by Germany, Denmark and Ireland. And for industrial electricity, so used for like large-scale operations like factories, we had the highest price for electricity over the same period. We've also got higher costs of electricity than places like the US and Canada. And London is one of the most expensive cities for household electricity. And as Gary was saying, that kind of comes down to that we're so reliant on gas for our power generation. And places like France, for example, it's much cheaper, and that's because they have the nuclear energy capacity. So they're not as reliant. And also places like Hungary and Bulgaria, it's cheaper there because they have more efficient power grids and they're not as reliant on gas as we are.
Yeah, so, I mean, Gary, some people, I think, just thinking about their domestic bills, they separate off in their minds gas and electric, and they think when Irene's talking about electricity there, what's that got to do with what you were saying about an over-reliance on gas? But the point is, our electricity comes from gas, and in other countries it doesn't.
Yeah, it's all to do with the way the UK energy system works, and we've got a system called marginal cost pricing. So what that means is essentially the most expensive type of energy is used to set the price. So that sets the price of renewables, it sets the price of everything. So we've actually got about almost 50% of the UK's energy generation is renewable, but because we have to turn on gas power plants to generate some of our electricity, it's that gas price that we have to pay because we just don't have enough renewables on the market to meet that whole demand. And another quirk of the system at the moment as well is that quite often we are actually having to pay some of these wind farms to turn off. So they might be generating loads and loads of power. We might have loads of demands down south, but we don't have the infrastructure to get from where it's being generated down to who needs it just because of the system. So we're paying, there's a wasted wind website quotes last week that actually thinks that we wasted £5 million on Tuesday alone. So that was £600,000 paying to switch off these wind turbines, with over £5 million buying energy elsewhere. So we're in a situation where we heard in the clip earlier that people are struggling to pay their bills. The fact that we're having to pay generators to turn off generating renewable energy seems absolutely astounding.
I mean, Elizabeth, I saw an op-ed about this in the Times, their leader column, I think it was on Wednesday, which did very clearly say, in their view, the obvious solution here isn't renewable. I mean, it might be a mix of things, but it's nuclear. If we had nuclear, we wouldn't be in this issue.
If we had nuclear, yeah, I have to agree, and I think that's why we're seeing an increase in nuclear power stations being built all around the world. France, as Irene said, is very heavy into nuclear. They have plans for 8 new reactors, South Korea also, and there was a report in Australia saying that adding nuclear to the energy mix could reduce their bills by up to 44%. So yeah, I'm very happy that we're beginning to refocus again on building smaller nuclear reactors.
I mean, what would you have said 20 years ago? You know, when the discussion was about we need to shut down nuclear, were you on the side then of doing that? I mean, the argument then was environmental. It was the fact that, you know, they're a risk for terrorism. Those things haven't gone away.
Those things haven't gone away, but I think we are much more aware of it. And of course, that means we can then take action to look after them better. There was a lot of lessons learned from Chernobyl and also from the reactor in Japan, whose name I've forgotten, I'm afraid.
Fukushima.
But you know, that's the one. You know, we've learned a lot of lessons, and the plan now is to have smaller reactors, so the risks wouldn't be quite so big.
I guess as well that when you're in the sort of black and white scenario of, well, do you want that or do you want coal? Then it feels like nuclear feels cleaner.
Exactly, it's a cleaner way to do it. I mean, if you look at the mining industry, there were deaths every year in mining industry right up until when it finished. That was not a safe way to get energy either.
But, Gary, you know, renewables was going to be the big thing that was going to help, you know, the nation's economy grow. And BP, just this week, have pulled a load of investment from renewables. Why?
Yeah, so, you know, 5 years ago, BP said, look, we're going to reduce the amount of oil and gas we produce. We're going to put a lot of investment into renewables. You know, back then it was a real kind of race to net zero. There was a real big positive energy behind it. And actually they thought they could make a lot of money aside from it as well. You know, the world's moved on a bit since then, you know, and this week the new chief exec has come out and said, actually, no, we're rowing back on that. We're going to go and focus on our core. You know, we're going to be spending the majority of our investment in oil and gas, just a tiny little bit on renewables now. You know, essentially, I think shareholders got a little bit of cold feet. We're looking across the likes of Shell and saying, hold on a minute, they're making even more than us because they've not put this twist towards renewables. They're focusing on our bread and butter. I think we need to revert back to that. So that's what they're doing, you know, and what that does for our race to net zero, I think you probably, you know, that's not going to help it at all. What it does for energy bills, well, you could think in the short term, you know, there's going to be more gas and oil on the market, so it could reduce prices. But again, on the long term, it's putting us further away from being able to get more renewables into the system.
OK, so it's not really, Irene, about doing what's right or doing what might even be profitable long term. It's about giving more money to shareholders in the short term. And we're seeing price rises in part because energy networks also want more money.
Exactly, and I think it's quite shocking. A recent report by Citizens Advice found that energy network owners have made £3.9 billion of excess profit from household bills over the past 4 years. And that happened after the industry regulator Ofgem overestimated the company's borrowing costs as interest rates have climbed. So it kind of feels like at the same time we're in this cost of living crisis, people are struggling to pay their bills. You know, these companies are getting this huge amount of money, and you know, Citizens Advice is calling for these firms to use the excess profits to support struggling households, to not just keep all of those profits. And people are calling for a social tariff to help the most vulnerable customers, and, you know, things like discounted energy bills. But it's quite shocking when you look at the disparity between those massive profits and the people who actually can't afford to make ends meet.
I think it's just that's quite an interesting one as well, because I think there's quite a lot of confusion with people around that. I think what you said is spot on. It's the networks and it's those producers of gas and oil. They're the ones who are making all the money on this. The energy retailers, who we have our direct relationships with, they are not making this big money. You know, under the energy price cap, that they can only make 2 to 3%, and that's about £40 a year per customer on average. So they're not making the big bucks. It's these, you know, the actual producers. And I'm not on here to defend energy companies, our energy retail companies, far from it. But I've worked with them quite a lot over the last few years, during the crisis. I led a working group with energy suppliers, consumer groups, charities at the height of the energy crisis, just trying to make sure that these energy companies treated customers a bit more fairly, paid a lot more attention to their most vulnerable customers. And I have to say, around that table, there was a real appetite, and we did get a lot done from the energy suppliers to better support their customers. So, before that, I was very much of these are these nasty people in big towers with all the money. But actually, seeing them on the ground, I do think that there is they're not perfect, but I think there is an element there that does want to help their customers.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've noticed just as a consumer is that my energy company now does, and didn't before, for years before didn't, but now does send me an email saying, we've got a cheaper tariff for you. They don't leave it for me to find out whether there's a cheaper tariff. And they make it very clear when I go on their website. Again, you need to be digitally savvy, don't you? But still, if you can get on their website, it's fairly clear which is the cheapest tariff. Elizabeth, you're moving house at the moment, aren't you? So you'll have been setting up all your energy suppliers from scratch. How easy is it to find the best deal?
It's a nightmare. There is just so much information out there that it's really, really difficult to rake through and find out what is the best deal for you, what is the best customer service as well, because you might have a great deal, but then if something happens, you've got terrible customer service, you don't want that. I want to say thank you, Gary. You can pay me later because Money Saving Expert is like one of the sites I go to try and make sense of it all. But it's things like, your standing order. So you might get told about the tariffs you're paying, but they don't tell you about the daily fees that you're going to be paying. And then there's hidden costs, and comparison sites don't have every utility company on them, so you never know if you're getting the right deal. I just want someone to, I just feel like putting a pin in a wall and just finding my energy supplier that way, because it is so difficult.
Okay, so Gary, you are here and you said you wanted to offer some advice. So briefly, what do we need to do? I mean, fix, basically, right?
Yeah, I mean, I understand exactly what Elizabeth's saying. Is it can be tricky, but there are sites out there, comparison sites out there, that can make it a little bit easier. But yeah, we're saying the prices are going up in April. If you're on the price cap, actually most people can undercap that by switching to a cheap fixed deal. Now, currently the cheapest fixed deal is around 6% less than the current price cap, which is obviously comparatively going to make an even bigger saving when the price goes up in April. And based on what we're expecting to happen over the course of the year, which is roughly stay at April's level, you're going to make a significant saving over that period by locking in a rate now on a fixed deal. The pop on a whole of market comparison. I mean, Olly, you said about energy companies messaging you directly with deals. As much as I just sort of, praise energy companies just now, I would also say, they are marketing you there. So be cautious about that. That may not be the best deal on the market. So pop on a comparison site. And actually,
yeah,
that's
but
why
I know I always come back at you on this, so I feel bad for putting you through the ringer. But what Elizabeth said about customer service is relevant there, isn't it? Because, of course, I know that if I looked around the market, there'd probably be a better deal. But I don't want to have to talk to another company. Last time I tried to switch, they ballsed it up, and I spent months emailing them about my tariff, and I was like, I don't work in energy. It's not worth it. It wasn't worth saving £10 a month to have this conversation. I'd have paid £10 a month not to.
Yeah, I mean, look, you have to also weigh up, the savings that you're likely versus the hassle, right? And you may decide that you actually want to pay slightly more for that peace of mind of going with a company who's got a good track record of service. A lot of the comparison sites, ours included, does have a service rating. We survey this regularly, and you can actually see how each has performed. But yeah, it comes down to are you willing to sort of make that effort, which I would say is fairly easy to do, to save hundreds of pounds, versus staying on a price cap and overpaying.
Irene, in terms of implications for all of us, beyond our domestic bills, this net zero goal, Keir Starmer's electoral pledge of slashing bills by £300 by 2030 doesn't seem like that's going to happen. And
it's not going to happen, no.
Transitioning us to non-natural gas, that doesn't seem like it's going to happen. So, that's pretty depressing, isn't it? People did vote for that.
It is quite bleak, and it was one of the main kind of pledges that I think people really were getting a bit excited about. So it feels like it's just a bit of a mess at the moment.
Can I step in as a former Labour councillor to say we are still working towards reducing bills by £300 a year? That is an aim, and it hasn't gone away.
But is it something the government can do? They've got the system where energy companies run everything, and then it's dependent on international market forces. It's a silly pledge to make.
Once that we get GB Energy up, then yes, because we will be working with the oil and gas companies and getting them to pay their share. Irenie was talking about the big profits they make. Well, those big profits are going to go towards helping other people reduce their bills under GB Energy. So yeah, it will happen.
Do you think, Gary, that net zero is plausible?
It possibly plausible, but certainly not in the timescales that have been set out. You know, there was a survey this week that said, you know, very few now of senior leaders in energy companies are expecting it to happen by the original deadline. You know, work is ongoing across the country at the moment. We're looking at how we're going to get bills down, you know, infrastructure to get more of this renewable energy from the sort, you know, the likes of the north of Scotland that was generating it down to the south. You know, that is ongoing, but that is a huge project to do that. You know, and the longer that takes, the more we're having to pay these wind farms to turn off, and the more we are exposed to the global market. There's another hot topic as well at the moment that's worth touching on is regional pricing. You know, this has been particularly, you might have seen it really being pushed by Octopus Energy and its founder Greg Jackson. Now, Octopus Energy actually now have overtaken British Gas as the sort of UK's biggest energy supplier over the last year, and they've got a really big green agenda. So it's probably not surprised that they're sort of pushing this. But what they're saying is, rather than a single countrywide price, what you'd have is electricity prices would vary, and essentially it would reflect the cost in that area. So if you're someone that lives next to a wind farm in the north of Scotland, you can expect cheaper prices. Now, they've got a new report they released this week that says thinks consumers could save an average of £3.7 billion a year if this would come in. Apparently, countries like Norway, Sweden, New Zealand have already sort of tapped upon this. What they're saying as well is, you know, it would also be great for businesses because they could relocate next to these places and obviously benefit from this cheaper electricity. Now, obviously, this has not been universally accepted, and it's probably no surprise that a lot of big industry are actually saying, realistically, am I going to, you know, uproot my established factory in whatever part of England to go nearer to a renewable wind farm in the north of Scotland? You know, what am I going to do with the 500 employees, etc.? So I think, you know, it's one option, but certainly, you know, it's one whereby there's going to be a lot of opposition, and there is a lot of opposition. However, I would say actually at the moment it looks like Ofgem are slightly in favour of this regional pricing perspective, so there'll be one to watch in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, could be some good news for your sexy Scottish fireman, Elizabeth, living up there. Up next, how one test might predict how you'll die. Would you want to know? That's after this. Irenie, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Could a single blood test predict your death?
Heart. As we get into our 50s and our 60s, the heart muscles, what we call our myocardium, start to lose oxygen. It's usually because of problems with the arteries. We get a hardening of the arteries. They become narrowed. As they narrow, we have less oxygen going to the heart.
It's a very cheery video there about cardiac arrest. Dr. Jeffrey Lakeman there for Wired, basically telling us, Irenie, that after the age of 40, we're doomed. Tell us more.
So yeah, I saw a really interesting study this week that was published in The Lancet, where researchers from UCL were able to use a single blood test to find out how quickly a person's internal organs were aging and then predict their risk of major diseases like cancer or dementia in the decades to come. So for example, if you had a heart that had aged more rapidly than other organs, that would lead to significantly higher chances of getting heart disease later down the line. Or if you kind of had older lungs, then you'd be more likely to get lung cancer or respiratory issues.
Okay, I mean, I'm new to this concept. I mean, your organs aging, they don't really age, do they? They're the age that you are, surely.
Well, I think what's quite interesting is that there's been a lot of advances in this area with blood tests kind of looking at being able to predict diseases in the future. But this was one of the first studies that actually looked at each of the different organs. And then what the scientists essentially did was they figured out how fast 9 of the organs were aging and then measured the gap between the person's actual age and the biological age of each of their organs. And what they found was that people's organs actually aged at different rates within the same person. So you might have a much older heart and then younger lungs, or the liver could be the problem. But obviously, if one organ is older, then that has a knock-on effect to the other organs.
Okay. I mean, it's still a difficult concept for me to understand. I guess we talk about, he's an old soul, he's young at heart. The idea that, my knees are 30, but my heart's 50, I find complex. But what are the ones you want to avoid then? What do you want? I mean, presumably you want them all to be as young as possible.
You want them all to be as young as possible, but I think the idea is that if you were to find out that you had, for example, an older heart, it's like you would know that you were more likely to have a heart attack or a stroke when you're older. So you could focus on doing things to bring that age down, essentially. So things like improving your exercise and improving diet, or if it was a problem with your lungs, you might think about giving up smoking.
So yes, Elizabeth, you could have a blood test that could tell you how old your various organs are and then act accordingly. Does that appeal to you as a disease prevention mechanic?
I have mixed feelings about it. I've done a similar sort of test. It wasn't a blood test, it was a wee test to check my bone density. And it was a bit scary actually, because it said I was the negative part of borderline, and that my calcium levels were at the lower levels of what they should be. So of course I then went out and redid my diet and did weightlifting and everything like that, which I did for about 6 months, and then you just fall back to normal. So I think the knowledge is there, but you have to educate people about what they need to do with that knowledge and give them the motivation to keep going as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it, Gary? Because people, even if they would like to know, even if it was just a case of, wee in a cup or poo in a thing or spit in a thing, and then you find out, yes, your lungs are old, so you should do this and this. You've got to be the person who then will go swimming every day or cut out meat. And you probably know that already, that would be good for you, and don't.
Yeah, you need that real incentive, to do that. But it got me thinking, what other kind of incentives could there be? I mean, I wonder if perhaps life insurance companies, may require, when you're taking out a policy, would they then say, right, you need to have this blood test, and we're going to use that as a risk assessment of you, and potentially we'll set your premium at this, but if you follow the guidelines of what's been suggested by this blood test, perhaps you then get a lower premium.
I mean, a lot of people would be freaked out by that idea and think it's disgusting, but actually, I mean, it would be fairer, wouldn't it? It wouldn't just be plucking a number from the air. It would be based on what's the probable outcome for you.
Yeah, and I think, as you talk about an incentive, you say, right, this is the situation you're in. If you want to save £20 a month off your life insurance premium, do this. That's that incentive to get out to the gym or eat better or whatever it may be.
But the negative is, I read a report in the Atlantic where a guy called Bill did a genetic test that showed he had a 25% increased risk of developing ALS, which is a form of motor neuron disease. He's a healthy 60-year-old. He has no signs of symptoms, no signs of anything. But because this test detected a possible future problem, he now can't get health insurance. Even though he has no signs of it, and he may never develop this disease.
And I suppose it also hints at that, would you want to know thing, Irene? Like, it's one thing to actually know that there's a flaw in one of your organs that you could help heal, but if it's just a test that can tell you you're more likely to die at 65 than 85, is that information you want when you're 45?
Well, yeah, and quite recently I got a letter in the post from the NHS asking me to take part in this big study where they were basically going to look into sort of a similar thing. I don't know if they were using blood tests, but that they would predict how likely I would be to get a range of things like dementia and cancer. And I was just like, I don't want to know. I'm not going to be involved in the study. And I've seen how it can make you really anxious, and that can be a positive thing, especially if you could get earlier treatment. But also, my brother had he had one of these health tests, and it was exactly this. He found out he had he's 35. He found out he had the lungs of a 20-year-old, but he had a much older heart, and he got really freaked out. And, he has made some changes. Who knows what will happen, but I think it kind of, it causes a lot of anxiety. I would be a bit nervous to get those results and to find the biological age of all of my organs.
But on the other hand, Elizabeth, and we've covered this on one of my other podcasts, The Modern Man, there is an issue in the UK specifically that because people rely on the NHS and possibly don't have private health insurance at all, they're not used to ever paying for a test. And actually in many other countries where they don't have such a support net, people do routinely pay this small amount of money for a test, 50 quid, 100 quid, because being preventable is much better than waiting for a symptom, which is what people do here when it might be too late for certain cancers.
Well, that's true, but then you have a huge health inequality with that. Whereas people who can afford these tests, and 50 to 100 quid might not be much to you, Ollie, but to some people, that's all they have to live on for a week.
Sure, but the NHS doesn't give it to them. I mean, that's the answer, is it? The state doesn't offer those tests, so you're more likely to get cancer here because you're not getting those tests.
But getting those tests is no prediction that A, you will develop any of these illnesses, or B, you will take the responsibility then to make sure that you don't develop those illnesses or that you report your symptoms earlier. It's putting an awful lot of onus on the person to then change their lifestyle, which unless you have the education and the backup to do that, may not happen. I mean, I am a prime example. I am an educated person, but I forget to take my calcium tablets. I go weeks, months without them when I know that's what I should be doing for my bones.
Gary, you've been looking into the Detection 2 test as well as another one.
Yeah, so this is another one where blood tests are being used to sort of spot stuff. So this is actually a clinical trial that's open to people who have had a skin cancer. The aim is basically to try and prevent unnecessary treatment. So at the moment, people who are diagnosed with melanoma, generally the cancer is removed successfully, but in a small percentage of patients, the cancer does come back. So on the NHS at the moment, patients are offered a 1-year preventative drug treatment, aimed at reducing the risk of reoccurrence. But with this new blood test, the idea in it would be possible to identify patients most at risk. So, further treatment is only really given if you need it. You can imagine having treatment when you don't need it, or taking medication when you don't need it, can have unnecessary side effects. And not only that, you need to think about the cost to the NHS of all this extra treatment. So that's one at the moment that's underway. And as somebody whose wife had a melanoma in recent past, anything that could do to sort of take away some of that angst and that worry that anything might be coming back has to be a good thing. So fingers crossed that this trial does go successfully.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, I also had a melanoma diagnosis a couple of years ago, and reading that was really exciting because, at the moment it's so reliant on you checking your own skin, going for biopsies. It would be pretty life-changing to have a blood test that could give you that extra level of reassurance so that you wouldn't have to worry about the cancer coming back.
And also this research does bring up some interesting things that you wouldn't predict, doesn't it? The link with Alzheimer's in this research wasn't about the brain, which interested me.
That was quite an interesting kind of twist. So the study actually found that the highest risk of dementia was in people whose immune systems aged faster than usual, not those whose brain was aging more rapidly in midlife. And that kind of supports earlier findings from other tests that have found that people prone to serious infections also have a higher risk of getting dementia later in life. And kind of it links kind of issues with inflammatory processes to how likely you are to get a neurodegenerative disease. So it's quite interesting. You would think, if I had an older brain, that would, straight away mean that. Another really exciting study looked into the risk of heart disease for women. So it measured 2 types of fat in the blood and managed to predict a woman's risk of cardiovascular disease decades later. And I think, studies like that are so important because research has been so focused on men and heart attacks. And so there's this gap in the research. So by having something that actually you could look at these levels of these fats in a woman's bloodstream and then predict, if she was at a higher likelihood of having a heart attack or a stroke in sort of 2 decades' time, that could be life-saving, really.
Yeah. No, we've covered that on the show many times before, haven't we? Like women not being part of these studies very often, so it's good to see that they are here. Well, on which note, I suppose I should say thank you to Irene, Elizabeth and Gary for bringing their young brains to the table today, their young tongues. Actually, I guess old brains. It's more like wisdom, isn't it? You can follow this show for free. Use your young fingers and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow with those dexterous digits of yours. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.com/subscription, a treat for old eyes. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.